Okay, continuing with bankruptcy, Chapter 17, Roman numeral 2, paragraph H, property of the bankruptcy estate. So, again, on the date that the petition is filed, let's say March 1st, the debtor files a petition in bankruptcy, and part of that filing is that the debtor has to provide a list of all of the assets that the debtor owns as of the date of the filing of the bankruptcy petition. And that constitutes or comprises the estate of the debtor, the debtor in bankruptcy. So, what is it that paragraph H is telling us? It says, all property of the debtor is part of the bankruptcy estate, again, on the date of the filing of the petition, including gifts, inheritances, life insurance proceeds, property from divorce settlements, municipal bond interest, received within 180 days after the filing of the petition. So, what this is saying is, so you own this property, that you provided on March 1st when you filed for bankruptcy. Oh, by the way, if you receive these types of property, gifts, inheritances, life insurance proceeds, property from divorce settlements, and municipal bond interest, you go forward within that 180 days beginning on March 1st and count forward 6 months, that property also becomes part of the debtor's bankruptcy estate. That's what that's telling us. So we move on to paragraph I, exempt property. So again, we start out with the premise that all property of the debtor becomes part of the bankruptcy estate, those assets. But there are certain property that is exempt from the bankruptcy proceedings. And so we see that, well, an individual debtor can keep certain property, again, it's called the exempt property, from being used to satisfy creditors. Again, remember Chapter 7 proceedings, which is the straight liquidation, applies both to individual debtors and also to businesses. So right now, in terms of exempt property, this situation, you'll see it says there's no exempt property for a business debtor. We're talking about, are there some exemptions? It literally is everything, including the shirt off your back, going to be used for distribution to creditors? And the answer is no. There are some limitations on that. There's certain property that the debtor gets to keep. And you see that paragraph 1 says, again, the federal bankruptcy statute says, look, here are the exemptions that we're providing, but we are going to grant to you, individual states, the opportunity to include your own exemptions as long as you follow the types of property we're establishing in the bankruptcy code, the federal bankruptcy code, but we will let you set your own limits. So one of the more common types of exempt property is what's called the homestead exemption. And I'll just make a brief mention of this. The homestead exemption is the equity in the house that you use as your primary residence. So some states follow the federal guidelines, which is 7,500. Okay, and in other states, Texas and Florida being the most notable in this category, have really high homestead exemptions, almost up to as much as $1 million. Again, we're talking about the equity in your house. So there is sometimes that can be seen as the opportunity for some pre-bankruptcy planning, if you want to think about it that way. That's like, okay, how do I keep as much of my capital or equity as possible? Maybe if I'm living in one of those states that has a really high homestead exemption, I buy property down there, and to the extent that that's the equity in my house, I get to keep that. It does not become available for creditors. So that's what the exempt property is all about. So then we move on to paragraph J, voidable transfers. Voidable transfers. So again, we're looking at that timeline. We said we filed for bankruptcy on March 1st. Okay, well, if the debtor, whether an individual or a business, transferred property within a time period prior to filing for bankruptcy. What's the time period? We're going to see that the time period in some cases is 90 days, but for at this point, we're just looking at on the date of the petition. Okay, you file the petition, right? And what a voidable transfer does, it says, you know what? We're going to go backwards in time and see if you were making transfers of property or cash prior to filing for bankruptcy. And if so, it's possible that the trustee can go to that recipient, that party that received that property, and again, the magic word here is set aside magic words. Set aside. What does it mean to set aside? That means the trustee asks the creditor who received that property, give it back. You have to give it back. You have to put it back into the till to be used for other creditors. You received what's called avoidable transfer, a transfer that can be avoided. And so you see is what paragraph J says, any transfer or payment which meets the requirements of avoidable transfer will be brought back into the bankruptcy estate and thus become available for distribution to the creditors. And there's two types of these types of transfers. One is the preferential transfer, and then the second one is a fraudulent transfer. And I'll cover those in subsequent videos.